Byridge First National Bank was a symbol of financial excellence, a place where money moved like water, effortlessly flowing between hands that already had too much of it. But beneath its marble floors and gleaming glass walls, the truth was far less elegant. The bank prided itself on personalized service, but everyone knew what that really meant. Service was quick if your skin was pale and your wallet heavy. Service slowed if your face told a different story. And sometimes service stopped altogether. The prejudice wasn't loud, it never had to be. It lived in the extra seconds a teller took before offering a greeting, in the sudden need for additional paperwork that appeared out of thin air, in the quiet shift in tone when someone whose wealth wasn't assumed stepped to the counter. For some customers, every visit was a reminder. Your money is welcome, but you are not. And sitting comfortably inside his corner office, overseeing it all, was Richard Calloway. Richard Calloway didn't see himself as racist. That word felt too messy, too obvious. Richard preferred the language of standards, professionalism, responsibility. He believed the bank had an image to maintain, a clientele to protect. And in Richard's mind, that clientele looked a certain way, spoke a certain way, lived a certain way. Whenever someone stepped inside the bank who didn't match that image, Richard didn't need to say much. A glance, a subtle nod to his staff. The message was clear. Make this difficult, make this slow, make them feel like they don't belong. To Richard, it wasn't personal, it was policy. He had become an expert at smiling while shutting doors. His voice always calm, always polite, yet every word told people exactly where they stood. The power to grant or deny opportunity lived in his handshake, in the way he leaned forward or stayed back, in the tone he used when he said the word unfortunately. And while the bank had shelves of official policies, the real rule book lived inside Richard's head, the rules no one wrote down but everyone understood. Who belonged, who didn't, who needed extra scrutiny, and who deserved a smooth path. For years, this unspoken system ran without interruption, until the day Elijah Carter walked through the door. Elijah Carter wasn't just a customer. He was the owner of Bay Ridge First National Bank. His name was on contracts Richard never read, hidden behind corporate layers that made the bank's true leadership invisible. But Elijah didn't come dressed in his tailored suits or with his entourage. That day he came as just another black man in jeans and a plain shirt. A man who wanted to open an account. Nothing more, nothing less. As Elijah stepped onto the marble floor, memories flooded back. Memories of being 19 and getting turned away for his first business loan. Memories of security guards trailing him through upscale stores, assuming he didn't belong. Memories of white bankers explaining interest rates with tones laced in doubt, as if money worked differently in his hands. Wealth had changed his life, but it had never changed how the world saw him. This visit was personal. It wasn't just about checking the bank's service. It was about testing his own legacy. After all the success, all the board meetings and awards, had he built something better? Or had he accidentally built another version of the same broken system? No cameras followed him, no announcement was made. Elijah Carter, the billionaire owner, walked through his own bank's door like a stranger, and what happened next would tell him everything. He stepped to the counter, offering the teller a polite smile. "I'd like to open a new account," he said, voice calm and clear. The teller's hesitation lasted only a moment, but Elijah caught it. He always caught it. That fleeting pause, where skin color rearranged assumptions. "I'll need you to speak with our branch manager," she said quickly, already looking away. Elijah followed her gaze, straight to Richard Calloway's office. Richard barely glanced up at first. His eyes skimmed Elijah's clothes, his posture, the absence of any visible signs of wealth. The decision was made before Elijah spoke a word. Richard folded his hands, offered a smile with no warmth. "I'm afraid we have strict requirements for new accounts," he said smoothly. "I hope you understand." It wasn't a refusal, not yet. It was the beginning of the dance. Richard asked for documents no other customer had ever been asked to provide. Proof of employment, personal references, letters explaining the origin of every dollar. "What kind of work do you do?" Richard asked, voice light but eyes sharp. "Something stable?" Elijah held his ground. offering each document without protest. But Richard was never going to approve that account. It wasn't about forms or policies. It was about Elijah. At last, Richard leaned back in his chair, sighing dramatically. "I'm sorry," he said, voice dripping with practiced regret. "I just don't think you meet the requirements for our services." Behind him, a few employees glanced toward the exchange, some curious, some amused, some quietly ashamed. Elijah said nothing. Not yet. He simply gathered his papers and left, the weight of the moment settling onto his shoulders like it always had. Outside the bank, Elijah stood still for a long time. He had faced worse than Richard Calloway, men who didn't hide their hate behind polite smiles. And yet, something about this cut deeper. This was his bank, his name, his legacy, and it had failed him. He took a deep breath, then reached for his phone. "Call my assistant," he said. "Tell them to arrange a meeting at the bank tomorrow morning. Mandatory, all staff." No anger in his voice, just certainty. Tomorrow, Elijah Carter wasn't coming back as a customer. He was coming back as the owner. The morning air inside Bay Ridge First National carried its usual weight, the quiet hum of wealth moving through polished hands. For some, this bank had always felt like home. For others, it had always felt like a locked door. When Elijah Carter stepped inside, dressed in worn jeans and a simple shirt, no one recognized him. No one saw the billionaire, the business mogul, the man whose decisions shaped their salaries and futures. They only saw a black man in casual clothes. And for Richard Calloway, that was enough. Elijah approached the teller, his voice calm. "I'd like to open a new account." The teller's fingers paused over her keyboard. She glanced at his clothes, at his face, at the color of his skin, and something flickered in her eyes. A hesitation, brief but sharp, like a judgment made in an instant. I'm going to have you speak with our manager for that," she said, her voice polite but distant. Elijah didn't argue. He knew this dance well, the silent shuffle of being passed along because no one wanted to serve him directly. He stepped toward Richard's office, the polished nameplate gleaming beneath the morning sun. Richard barely looked up when Elijah entered. His glance swept over him, eyes tracing every inch of casual fabric, every sign of supposed insignificance. In that glance, the decision was made. Elijah Carter did not belong. Richard folded his hands together and smiled. A smile without warmth, only quiet judgment disguised as courtesy. "I'm afraid we have some strict requirements when it comes to opening accounts," Richard said, his voice calm, rehearsed. Elijah's expression didn't change. He was familiar with this tone, the politeness sharpened into exclusion. "That's fine," he said softly. "I have everything you need." But Richard wasn't looking for proof. He was building a wall. "We'll need extra documentation, of course," Richard continued. "Proof of income, employment history, tax returns, and personal references. It's all standard policy for someone in your situation." "In my situation?" Elijah asked, voice still calm. Richard's smile didn't falter. "Well, we like to know who we're doing business with." Elijah provided every paper requested, each document sliding across the desk in silence. But Richard's questions grew sharper, wrapped in polite suspicion. "So, what is it you do exactly?" Richard asked, voice dancing between curiosity and doubt. "Something steady, I hope?" Elijah answered each question with the same quiet dignity, never raising his voice. But inside, the familiar sting began to rise. The knowledge that no matter how much he had built, no matter how far he had come, he was still being tested for permission to exist in a space his own money built. Finally, Richard leaned back, sighing as if exhausted by the very idea of Elijah banking there. "I'm sorry," Richard said, voice full of empty regret. "I just don't think you meet the standards for the type of clientele we're looking for." A silence settled between them, a silence so loud it filled the entire room. From nearby desks, employees glanced over, some with curiosity, some with quiet amusement, and a few with shame too soft to speak out loud. Elijah stood gathering his documents. No argument, no raised voice, just the quiet understanding of a man who had lived this moment too many times to count. Wealth hadn't protected him. Success hadn't shielded him. In this moment, Elijah Carter wasn't a billionaire. He was just a black man who didn't belong. He walked out, shoulders heavy with both old pain and fresh anger. Outside the bank, the air felt cooler, sharper against his skin. Elijah stood still, letting the moment settle into his bones. He had built this bank. His money had filled its vaults, and yet here he stood, rejected from his own creation. He took a deep breath, steadying the rage that simmered beneath his skin. Memories poured in, uninvited. The first loan denied when he was just 19. The salespeople who followed him through stores. The bank managers who spoke to him like a child. It didn't matter how much money he had, how much success he earned. In their eyes, he was still less. But this time, it wasn't just a personal insult. It was a betrayal. His name was on the paperwork, his vision buried beneath the marble floors. If this bank was broken, it wasn't because of Richard alone. It was because Elijah had trusted that wealth alone could change the world. He pulled out his phone, his voice steady as steel. "Call my assistant," he said. "Set up a mandatory meeting at the bank tomorrow morning. All employees." There was no anger in his voice, only resolve. While Elijah stood outside, breathing through old wounds, Richard Calloway sat comfortably inside his office, reliving the encounter like a trophy. "You should have seen him," Richard said later that day, chuckling as he told the story to a fellow manager. "Came in here like he had a chance, you can always tell." The other man forced a laugh, the kind people give when they know they shouldn't laugh at all. Richard leaned back in his chair, proud of the way he handled this situation. To him, this was leadership, protecting the bank's image, keeping the wrong kind of people on the outside looking in. Samantha Reed stood a few desks away, her hands shaking slightly as she typed. She had watched it all, felt her stomach twist when Elijah left, but said nothing. Like too many times before, silence felt safer than speaking up. Richard's confidence only grew, feeding off the quiet approval that surrounded him. This was how the system worked. The powerful remained powerful because no one dared disturb the peace, but what Richard didn't know, what no one knew, was that the peace had already been broken. The storm had already begun. Tomorrow, Elijah Carter was coming back, and this time he wasn't asking for service. He was giving orders. The email arrived before the doors even opened. Every employee at Bay Ridge First National Bank saw the subject line flash across their screens. Mandatory staff meeting, 9 o'clock a.m. Sharp, no explanation, no context, just an order from the corporate office, bypassing the usual chain of command. At first, no one thought much of it. Meetings happened, policies shifted. It was the way banks worked. But something about this one felt different. The air carried a quiet charge, like a storm building just beyond sight. Richard Calloway walked into the room with his usual swagger, a man convinced that no meeting could ever shake his throne. In his mind, this was just another performance, a chance to spin numbers, flaunt his authority, maybe remind corporate how essential he was. He barely noticed the way the other employees sat stiffly in their chairs, exchanging uneasy glances. Even Samantha Reed, who usually faded into the background, seemed unusually tense, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The room settled into silence as the clock struck 9. And then, the door opened. Elijah Carter stepped inside. There was no disguise now. No worn jeans, no plain shirt. Today, Elijah came dressed in power. His tailored suit, sharp and unmistakable, spoke for him before he said a single word. For a long moment, no one breathed. Richard's smile froze halfway across his face, confusion flickering into panic as the truth hit him like cold water. The man he had dismissed, the man he had judged and rejected, the man he believed belonged anywhere but here, was standing at the head of the room. Elijah let the silence stretch, his eyes scanning each employee, some embarrassed, some ashamed, and a few quietly relieved that someone, at last, had come to break the silence they had lived with for too long. "I was here yesterday," Elijah said, his voice calm but heavy with purpose. "I stood in this very bank. I asked for the same service anyone else would expect." He let the words settle, giving each one room to breathe. And I was denied. The murmurs began, soft, uncertain, a ripple of realization spreading through the room. Some remembered seeing him, others only heard whispers after he left. But now they knew. The man they had all assumed was just another outsider stood revealed as the owner of everything around them. Elijah stepped forward, closing the space between him and Richard. Their eyes locked, but it was clear. Only one of them still held power. "You looked me in the eye," Elijah said softly, "and you made a decision before I said a word. You asked for paperwork no one else would have been asked for. You questioned my job, my stability, my right to sit at this table." Richard's face drained of color, his usual confidence crumbling like sand beneath a rising tide. Elijah's voice never wavered. "Tell me, Mr. Calloway, would you have treated me the same if I had walked in wearing this suit?" Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came. There were no excuses left to offer, no policies to hide behind. "You saw my skin," Elijah continued. "Not my story, not my work, not my worth." The room stood still, every word peeling back a layer of carefully masked prejudice that had shaped this place for years. "You decided I didn't belong. Not because of my character, not because of my qualifications, but because you couldn't imagine a man like me belonging in a place like this." For a brief moment, Richard tried to muster some defense, some explanation to soften the edges of his disgrace, but there was nothing left to say. The truth stood bare, undeniable. Elijah stepped back, his voice shifting from personal to official. "Effective immediately, Richard Calloway is terminated from Bay Ridge First National Bank. There will be no appeal." The air shifted in the room, a collective gasp, a sharp intake of breath as the weight of the moment settled over every employee. Before Richard could argue, security appeared at the door, the very force he once commanded, now summoned to escort him out. He walked past desks where employees stared, some in shock, others in quiet satisfaction. For years, Richard had ruled this bank through silent prejudice, wrapped in polite professionalism. Today, that power dissolved in front of everyone. As Richard disappeared through the doors, Samantha let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. For the first time, the air felt lighter. Elijah turned to face the staff, his voice no longer angry, but resolute. "This bank will not be a place where skin color decides who gets served, who gets loans, who is made to feel like they belong." He paused, letting the promise settle deep. "If you work here, you are a part of that change." Some employees nodded, others looked away, but all of them understood the message. The rules had changed, and with them, the future of Bay Ridge First National. Elijah knew this moment wouldn't fix everything. Prejudice doesn't vanish in a single speech. But today, a line had been drawn, and for the first time, Bay Ridge wasn't just a bank. It was a beginning. Tomorrow, the real work would start. But today was the first seed of a legacy rewritten. The day after Richard Calloway was escorted out of Bay Ridge First National, the air inside the bank felt different. There was no official announcement to customers, no banner hung from the marble walls. But for those who worked there, something had undeniably shifted. For years, Richard's rules had shaped this place, rules that were never written down, but followed like law. Who got approved? Who got denied? Who was made to feel welcome? Who was quietly pushed out the door? Now those rules were gone, and Elijah Carter wasted no time making that clear. By noon, every department head received an email directly from Elijah himself, outlining a series of sweeping changes. The kind of changes that didn't just tweak policies, but tore them down to the foundation. There would be no more unwritten barriers, no more unspoken lists of who belonged and who didn't. Every customer, regardless of skin color, language, or background, would receive the same respect, the same service, and the same chance. For too long, wealth had been treated like a password, something you could only prove if you fit the right profile. Elijah knew that profile well. He had been excluded by it, and now he was rewriting it. By the end of the day, Elijah made one more change, one that carried more weight than any policy ever could. Samantha Reed, the young banker who had spent years watching Richard's quiet discrimination unfold, was named the new branch manager. It wasn't just a promotion. It was a message. Elijah didn't want someone who knew how to follow the old rules. He wanted someone who had seen them for what they really were and knew how wrong they had been. As Samantha stood in Richard's old office, the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, Elijah's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't manage this bank the way Richard did. Manage it the way it should have been from the start. And with that, the door to the past quietly closed. It didn't take long for the apologies to begin. That afternoon, a small group of employees gathered in the break room. Their hands were restless, some fiddling with pens, others gripping paper cups of coffee they had no intention of drinking. When Elijah walked in, the room went still. It wasn't part of any official meeting. No memo had been sent, but one by one, the words started to spill out. "I should have said something," one teller admitted, her voice trembling. "I saw the way Richard treated people like you, and I stayed quiet." Another employee, eyes cast down, added softly, "It wasn't just Richard. We all let it happen." Elijah listened, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to make them comfortable, because comfort wasn't the point. "You were silent," Elijah said at last, "and silence has consequences." The room grew heavier. "But," Elijah continued, "you're here now, and what matters is what you do next." No one spoke. No one dared. "This bank is changing," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. "And change isn't comfortable. It means speaking up, even when your voice shakes. It means choosing what's right, even when it's easier to look away." He let the silence stretch, giving each word time to land. "You don't owe me an apology. You owe one to every person who walked through those doors and left feeling small." One teller wiped her eyes. Another nodded quietly. "This is your second chance," Elijah said. "Take it." The apologies ended, but the reckoning had just begun. The next morning, Elijah stood before a different crowd. This time, it wasn't employees. It was the community itself. Small business owners, community leaders, and families filled the folding chairs inside a local community center. Some had been denied loans by the very bank Elijah now controlled. Others had stopped applying long ago, convinced the doors were never meant for them. Elijah stepped to the front of the room, no speech in hand, just truth in his heart. "This bank belongs to this community," Elijah began, and for too long it forgot that. He told them about the new programs launching immediately: low-interest loans for minority-owned businesses, fast-track approvals for first-time entrepreneurs, and financial literacy workshops designed for people who had been ignored by the banking world for generations. "This isn't charity," Elijah said. "This is opportunity. The same opportunity some people are born into, the rest of us have to fight for it." A woman in the front row raised her hand. "What makes this any different?" she asked. "Banks always say the right things. Then the door shuts the minute you need real help." Elijah didn't flinch, because this time, the door belongs to someone who stood on the outside. The room was quiet, but in that quiet, something shifted. Later that afternoon, Elijah walked back through the doors of Bay Ridge First National, not as a test, not in disguise, just as himself. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar in that space. Hope. The tellers greeted him without hesitation. Customers of all backgrounds stood in line, waiting to be served, not judged. Samantha stood at the edge of the floor, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the room, not for who didn't belong, but for who needed help. Elijah didn't need a press conference or a headline to know change had started. He could see it in the small things, the way people stood taller when they walked through the doors, the way tellers spoke with real warmth instead of forced politeness. As Elijah passed Samantha's desk, she looked up and met his eyes. No words passed between them. They didn't need any. Both knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the first chapter of a new one. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had changed. Cars sped past. Pedestrians hurried by. But Elijah saw it differently now. Every person who passed those glass doors carried a story, some of struggle, some of survival, all of them deserving of dignity. He had spent his life building wealth to break barriers, but now he understood the truth. Real wealth wasn't in what you owned, it was in what you made possible for others. For the first time in a long time, Elijah Carter wasn't just a businessman. He was a builder of doors, doors that stayed open for everyone. And even though the fight wasn't over, for today, hope was enough.